It matters whether or not you're able to form a good therapeutic alliance, get people to understand the problems they have, motivate them to make changes, hold a positive relationship, instill hope, and cultivate adaptive transformation. That's the process.
We'd like to welcome Dr. Gregg Henriques to the channel. It's a pleasure having him. We shared a recent post about some of the upcoming epic dialogues and conversations that we've been having. One of them, and these were all afforded to us, the opportunity was given to us by the network around John Vervaeke. So thank you to John Vervaeke in extension for sharing all of his friends with us. It's been a pleasure. We spoke with Guy Sandstock the other day, and we had a great conversation over on his channel.
I saw that on your channel. Look forward to, I take a walk, 4-mile walk every day. So that's where I listen to a lot of podcasts, and it's on the top of my list to listen to you and Guy's conversation.
We had a lot of fun. We got into language and mysticism. We got into the specifics of Jewish mysticism around language and the creative power that is involved in that. We spoke about why mysticism is relevant for a modern person, an idea which may seem very arcane, and so many other topics. It was really exciting. It was really very much a case of language sort of grappling at its edges. And today we have the chance to sit with Dr. Gregg Henriques, who's a professor of psychology at JMU and the founder of the Theory of Knowledge Society. Dr. Henriques has developed an integrative meta-theoretical framework for the field of psychology and has a blog on Philosophy Today called Theory of Knowledge, where he posts his latest thinkings. If any of this needs correction, please do correct me. We had the chance of having previously a fantastic conversation between the two of us, exploring some of the parallels between Gregg's work in his unified theory of knowledge, UTOK, as he calls it, and mysticism, which is my passion. And we thought we would sit down again to have a proper recorded conversation with some laid out topics in advance so that the audience could enjoy this interaction as well, and it wasn't just kept selfishly between us, although it was definitely worth it for its own right. And God willing, I'm going to also come onto Gregg's podcast, and it's going to be more about my side of things, sharing a bit of my journey and mysticism and Jewish mysticism and philosophical mysticism, and very much looking forward to that. Gregg, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. And listening to you talk with John Vervaeke, because I had to thank you, John, and finding those connections. And that's what's really, John is a node and networking together. So it's beautiful. And then as soon as I saw Seekers of Unity, and then saw what this blog is about, what your journey is about, I was like, oh my gosh, there's the kinship was felt immediately, friend. And I deeply enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to future ones. And so I'm really just thrilled to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. I'm really glad that it's mutual, and it's so beautiful to be able to be sitting engaged in conversation that's both alive emotionally, where we're both so happy to even though we would never have known each other on the street, but very quickly we've become quick friends. So there's both the heart element there. There's a lot of love that I feel, a lot of care. And I felt that both with Guy and with John. And there's also the capacity to bring in the mind together with that. It's not like the mind and heart are mutually exclusive. And hopefully there's going to be, on the basis of love, there's going to be a lot of mind and a lot of rigorous thinking, a lot of discussion, a lot of big words.
You set for dialogos, right?
Exactly.
The deep relation that affords insight and wisdom in authentic dialogue. So it's beautiful.
Gregg and I, before this conversation, we decided that we're not going to do a full overview of John's system, which he's done many times, and that would definitely fill up the if not the entirety, at least the bulk of this conversation. So perhaps if people are getting lost in the conversation, it might be worth taking a break and looking at some of Gregg's overviews that he's presented copious amounts of times. Instead, I chose 6 topics which I'd like to get into, which surround the journey around and the thinking around the theory. So if you came for the theory itself, I saw Gregg recently did a great conversation called Tour of the Cathedral. You did that on whose channel was that with?
Was that on Parallax, I think?
Yes, I think it was.
Parallax with Andrew Sweeney.
Yes.
Yep.
And a lot of,
I could send a link to that.
A lot of you did one recently as well on the Stoa. You've done it in a bunch of places. And what I'd like to ask instead are going to be these 6 questions. One of them is, I'd like to know about when did this click for you? What was the moment of transformation, transition? What precipitated that, and what was that like for you? That's number 1. Number 2 is, we wanted to get some of your thinking and some of sort of your applied theory on the soft and, more importantly, the hard problem of consciousness, and we'll take the time to explain what those are to the audience. Those that don't know, don't worry, but I know that Gregg has some fascinating insight on those questions. That's number 2. Number 3 is his thoughts on what he and John have been calling Enlightenment 2.0, or the next axial age, this coming age, sort of the 5th cone of his theory, and we want to hear about that. That's always exciting, of what's next, what's coming. Number 4 is going to be Gregg's thoughts on higher states of consciousness, this sort of the classical mystical experience from a perspective as a clinical psychologist and a grand theoretician. And finally, if we get the chance to talk about these final 2 things, we're going to talk about the role that ideas have beyond just their persuasiveness and their cogency and their logical consistency, but also their presentability and their popularity outside, and whether that's a disconcerting thought, which is that ideas don't necessarily take over because of their coherence, cogency, persuasiveness. It's a popularity contest as much as anything else.
Yeah, that's
it's a problem. It's a problem which definitely I lose a lot of sleep over. So we hope to hear about that. And number 5 is going to be, how does all of this theorizing help people in the therapy room and help us be better people to ourselves, in our relationships, to strangers around us, to the world around us? Because a lot of, as we're going to hope to hear, a lot of Gregg's work begins from the therapy room, and I want to know how it ends in the therapy room. And we hope to get into all kinds of epic stuff. Just to give one final word before we turn the floor, in a recent email, Gregg wrote to me that the Gregg system emerges out of a quest to develop a coherent, wise, psychotherapeutic stance to address suffering and foster optimal living based on the best science of our day. And I could not think of a better way to begin this conversation. We here at Seekers of Unity, following a tradition rich in mysticism and rich in Buddhism, the idea of alleviating suffering, of finding a best way to foster optimal living, is so appropriate. So thank you for joining us for the conversation once again.
Great. It's great to be here. So, I've always been interested in talking with people authentically. That's my disposition as a senior in high school. I took a class on psychology. I liked the professor. It seemed to be a fascinating field. And it resonated with me at a couple of different levels. It resonated with me in terms of, when I look back at my history, it's like, hey, what are the things that I like them, what's my language of love in the world? And really quality time and really talking with people is one language of love. And a second is suffering hurts me. It's like seeing people suffer hurts. I want to go in. I have a pretty strong maternal orientation to care for vulnerable individuals who are suffering and are blocked in by life and want at least company and possibly ways out. So the idea that you get trapped by life in particular kinds of ways, you're isolated, you're alienated, you're bitter, you're lonely, and the capacity to enter into that space and perhaps help people untangle some of those knots was always sort of a natural inclination of mine. And that's a pretty decent description of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy basically is an opportunity. You create a context where individuals, know to go see you as a psychological doctor. Outpatient psychotherapy for psychological doctors is people basically trapped either in their behavior patterns, their relationship patterns, or the way they relate to themselves in these entrenched maladaptive cycles. They know they're not reaching their fulfillment, but they don't know how. They got what John would call reciprocally narrowed into some dead end. And a part of them says, God, I think I can get out of this, but I don't know how. And then that creates all sorts of internal and relational and habitual problems. You open your eyes, and it may not be terribly rare for you to see people trapped in these kinds of frames of reference. In fact, in terms of health concerns, I think you could actually argue that these are the largest domains of health concerns. So they're more important than medicine and cancer in relationship to quality of life.
Well, yeah.
So you put it in those terms, it's like, well, that's a big deal. There's an epidemic of depression and anxiety that's spreading throughout the West. And it's particularly apparent in our children. So we should be aware of that. And that's sad, because that's a lot of brutal, people get trapped in these things. I work with suicidal individuals. People kill themselves over this stuff. It's pretty brutal. So I entered then, after my undergraduate, where I majored in psychology, I went off to graduate school, and I entered into a terminal master's program at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And this is where the transformation in me starts to what would become the unified theory, first of psychology, and then it evolves into knowledge. And if you think, unified theory of knowledge, the first thing that should go off is some quack meter that's like, this guy's insane. Right?
That was my first reaction. I'll be honest.
Let's have it. If you're paying attention, the first reaction should be, this guy's a quack. So I'm a psychologist and a clinical psychologist, that I will empathize with that first reaction, and we can just hold it and be like, yes, that's a good first reaction to have. Now we can stay that and ask these kinds of questions. Well, is it really? And then we can find out whether or not there's actually a path of wisdom here to be gleaned from this, or as opposed to just hit the delete button. But anyway, here's the path. So the path starts, the tarmac, I love that analogy, starts with people that are suffering, and the idea that you can utilize psychological therapeutic orientations to help people.
Yeah. Were you, Gregg, were you working, sorry to interrupt, were you working specifically with people that were suicide risk? Was that, because I know that's one of your specialties.
Well, that becomes one of my specialties. This is in 1993, 94. I'm a graduate student in it as a master's. So I'm just getting introduced to it. And it turns out that this is my knack. This is where what I'm very good at is empathizing with the psychology of people's psychology. For whatever reason, I can just hear somebody and hone in. I suck at music. I can't carry a tune unless it's stapled to my back. But if I hear somebody's narrative, for some reason, I can immediately grab a hold of that and fill in with a good degree of accuracy the dynamics of that. And this is happening here in 1994. I get put into a place at the University of Pennsylvania from 1999 to 2003, where I work with a guy by the name of Aaron Beck. And if you know anything about psychotherapy, he's one of the fathers of cognitive psychotherapy, which is a major field. And when I got placed in that, a major grant was funded, for which I became a project director, which was applying cognitive psychotherapy to individuals who had recently made a serious suicide attempt. So everybody that came into the study had recently made a suicide attempt. It was a serious, in inner city Philadelphia. Okay, so we're talking people impoverished, homeless, drug addicted, brutalized by life across a multitude of different ecological developmental layers. And that was the population I worked with for 4 years. It was an intense population. And just lots of stories there.
Just to give me and the audience a sense, how many such individuals have you sat with in therapy and study? Like, just to...
Well, we brought in over 180 individuals. And I did, for the initial part, I did virtually all of the original assessments for big chunks of them. And then we realized the project was way too big. I couldn't handle it. Then we hired people to do the assessments. And then I took over the psychotherapy, maybe of about a third of them. Other people other doc students, postdoctoral individuals, and a few other people would help. So we created a team. The ultimate study looked like this is actually, it's a fascinating story. There was a study one where we did it with 60 individuals and actually didn't really work at all. And then we developed study two, a randomized controlled trial where we identify 120 people, basically a flip of the computer coin, and they either get assigned to enriched care, which is basically just some monitoring you what you ever did, versus the addition of cognitive therapy, which is then you get assigned to one of us and then you would work treatment. And we found that the outcome, it helped, although it's very complicated to say what exactly helped. But we produced arguably with the most dysfunctional population, the least dose that was actually given to get the most effect. It's really a powerful and fascinating study. It gets published in the Journal of American Medical Association. Although what gets published relative to what we did is always, it almost is fraudulent. It's an interesting story. But it is, but it's fascinating. But yeah, I ran that study. I was the project director for it. It's the largest study for suicide, I think, that's been done, certainly been published. And I learned a huge amount. But yes, that's 180 people that have made suicide attempts that you have contact with. It gives you a flavor for what you're looking at. That's for sure.
Wow. I'm curious to know what the expectation, just briefly, because we're not going to focus here on this element of it, but briefly, what was it that you were going in looking to the study expecting to see, if you had some expectations or hoping to find, and what is it that you found in the end, and did those confirm or disconfirm what you expected initially?
Well, the basic issue was if you got a brief focused cognitive therapy intervention, okay, which like 10 sessions that was focused on the treatment of the reduction of suicidal behavior. Like when you get stressed, suicidal ideation generally can be thought of as a kind of problem solving. Shit happens, you get all flustered, you remind you how miserable at least a part of you is. When you're stuck in psych ache, that's the depth of your misery is called psych ache. One rational solution is, well, if I'm going to be like this forever, kill yourself. Okay. And so it's sort of, you can think about it as a problem solving solution for, you get reciprocally narrowed, and then people that develop this as a possible problem solving actually then find this. So then the basic intervention, which has certain logic to it, and I support it at some level, but there's a whole story that I think gets in, makes this really complicated. But that's the basic logic. And cognitive therapy then tries to make people aware of how they solve problems, get them to be aware of how they can make inferences or attributions or explanations that trap them further, and then teach them skills to stop that problem. We talk about put a basement on the suffering and then make more adaptive decisions. Often, for example, do nothing. It's usually better than take 50 pills, do nothing. Okay. So there are a whole host of different kinds of strategies. A fascinating study of targeted suicidal behavior. That's interesting. Many studies target like diagnoses, this type of suicidal behavior. And so our primary outcome was what was time to next attempt, the numbers of people and how long it took them until they would make a second suicide attempt. The argument being, if you got flipped the coin and was in the cognitive therapy condition, you'd be less likely to make another suicide attempt and the time would be more delayed. And we definitely found that to be the case. They also then had secondary measures about amount of suicidal ideation, the amount of self-reported depression, the amount of clinical assessment depression, the amount of hopelessness, and then a whole other secondary set of functioning. And we generally got positive impact for people that were in the treatment. When you compare the 60 that were randomly assigned to that versus 60 that were just followed, we got a pretty bigger effect than I was expecting, that's for sure, given what I was looking at up front when we sort of broke the line and said, hey, okay, we're ready to analyze the data. Does it matter if we look at this? And the answer was, yeah, it mattered. But what mattered and why is a very complicated question. Sure. But anyway, that was
from the raw data to interpretation is worlds. Take us back to your story that you were telling us.
Right. So what happened to me in terms of psychotherapy is that I start to get trained. I'd studied psychology. I took 60 credits of psychology. It was definitely my love. And then I get into the psychotherapy room. And I get raised as sort of a Dawkins-esque atheist, by the way. My dad actually has a Billy Graham evangelical born-again awakening. And then the light on that goes out and he then shifts into become a history professor and we get raised. So he has this sort of classic theistic versus atheistic. Those are your only two options. Turns out not necessarily. But when I was raised as a kid, those were basically the options. So that gives you a little. So I love science. And then I was a believer in science. And then I was like, well, hey, we could do psychology and we can maybe even do psychology better, although that wasn't really my focus. It was then when I got into the psychotherapy room. Okay. You start getting trained in psychotherapy. And what happens in psychotherapy is when you get trained in is you get introduced to all these different schools of thought, how to do it. Okay. I was taught as an undergraduate that cognitive behavior therapies were more scientifically demonstrated to be better. You may even hear that if you go around. Oh, these are CBT is the empirically supported treatment. It's actually, that's bullshit. That's wrong, completely wrong in my estimation. Okay, but that's mantra. That's like the institution, or at least pieces of the institution believe that. I don't believe that at all. What I believe is actually the best of the best get the best outcomes. Okay. So, and really that's the evidence is crystal clear. So if you're really good people get good outcomes. And it doesn't matter
whatever modality you're practicing, right?
Whatever your modality, okay, good people get good outcomes, lousy people get lousy outcomes, and most people get the average outcomes. And it really doesn't matter what school you're in, but it matters whether or not you're able to form a good therapeutic alliance, get people to understand the problems they have, motivate them to make changes, hold a positive relationship, instill hope, and cultivate adaptive transformation. That's the process. And you can do that from any number of the schools of thought. Yeah. The best of the best get good outcomes. The lousy people don't. I start seeing this, okay, in my training. In fact, I had a really lousy CBT supervisor. Okay. Then I had this great she was an African woman who knew about African theory. She also knew about existentialism. She was a humanist and she was wonderful. And I was like, oh my God, this CBT person sucks. And this person enlivens me in a totally different way. She's clearly a healer. This person's not. The science, whatever, and then you look carefully at the studies, and that's exactly what the science tells you that if you know how to look.
Yeah. It's interesting because right before we started this conversation, just between me and you, we'd mentioned R.D. Laing. And I've been a fan of his work for some time, although I'm a total amateur when it comes to psychology. But just reading this as a layperson, he makes this point repeatedly that really the therapy, the healing happens in that human relationship, in that space of care that's developed between the therapist and the client. And as well, he seems to divorce it from really the functionality of the particular modality. It's really, are you able to invest that space with your humanity to be reciprocal to the humanity of the person that you're trying to help heal?
That's the foundational therapeutic alliance principle that I would argue all good therapy begins with that. I would say that Carl Rogers gets this better than Freud or the behaviorists. And really, that's why I say all good therapy begins with Rogers, because it begins with an appreciation of the alliance. Okay? And actually, the alliance has three elements to it. First is cultivating a quality relationship. So that if I'm your doctor, you trust me and you believe that I'm invested in your care and best interests. Dynamic one. Dynamic two is together, we help understand the entrenched maladaptive problems you find yourself in, so that increases your awareness and your ability to narrate the kind of problems that you're in. Okay. And then the third developmental sequence is to motivate you and to see in a zone of proximal development the kinds of interventions you think would help, so that you can bring intrinsic motivation to make those changes. The active part of intervention.
Yes.
So in the therapeutic alliance really is the intersection between, hey, good relationship, good understanding of the problem, and you see a path of investment for transition, so that you can detect recursive relevance realization and find the path, and then feel the self-efficacy growth. And those are the process dimensions of therapy. And there's 6 million ways to get that path. But that's the path that you really need to find. And the evidence is crystal clear that the process of that path is what defines good therapy, not whether you put out a little shingle that says, oh, CBT on a randomized controlled clinical trial beat a control group. That's actually bullshit at some level, or at least it's meaningless at a sophisticated level. So R.D. Laing's 100% correct in my estimation.
I feel like in those 2 minutes, there was like hundreds of hours worth of like psychology study in those very three simple steps. And that was really beautiful. And the fact that you emphasized that the intrinsic desire to be able to go and fix those problems, I mean, your wording, having been in this field for decades, was very precise and on point, and I really appreciate that. Just one anecdote here. I managed to I had the great opportunity of having lunch with Joe Burke, who was one of R.D. Laing's, one of his very loved students. And we were sitting with Joe, and we asked him, he also a very fascinating character, very fascinating story in his own. The man had many fingers and lost his father I think even before he was born. And a really tremendous story that he transitioned his own suffering into healing for so many others, for hundreds of others. And I asked him what was the primary. I mean, Laing's obviously famous for healing schizophrenics without any medication. I think the first to do that. And we asked him what was his secret to helping people heal, both his and Laing's. And he said his answer. He had a very like crass. He passed away recently. May his memory be a blessing. He had a very crass and open sense of humor, and he said that the way that people were healed, in his own experience, was with expensive cognac. And I was like, what, expensive cognac? Like, you're giving alcohol to people that are like schizophrenic? Like, what? And he's like, well, you come to these patients who, some of them are not even speaking at all. They're not even making eye contact with a therapist. They're totally recluse. They're violent and dangerous. This is the first thing you want to do, is you want to show them that you bought a very expensive bottle of cognac, that you really care enough about them to really invest, and not just buy a cheap bottle, but an expensive bottle. And then he had a whole process that he would pour the cognac, and he would make a whole mix out of it in front of the patient, and really basically in every act showing how much he cared about the person, how much he was willing to share as a friend with them. I'm sharing my good alcohol with you. I'm taking the time to make a great mix with you. And once they were able to drink together, and really create that human bond, only then was there potential for healing. So that was a really cute anecdote, which will stick with me for a long time.
Beautiful. So the yellow circle back there, which is the fourth branch on the tree, called the influence matrix. Inside of that's a little thing called the black line. Okay. The black line has two circles on it, one that represents high relational value and the other represents low relational value. It's the way the heart detects whether or not it's known in value. That's what the circle represents. And that is the center of psychosocial health, meaning to be known and valued by important others is the central energy, and to be devalued and not known shrinks the soul, basically.
That is so true. That is really, really, really so true.
So to hone in on that and to demonstrate that, to come in as a high status person and then to connect and to see the heart of the other person and to invest in them in a particular way, that if you do it skillfully, they're not feeling manipulated, or that you're going through a particular routine, but you've developed a healing practice and you have some magic, but that you can connect to their unique soul and that you see them through that. Boom, that system is like, that's the organismic valuing process, and it will wake itself up. So that's
incredible.
I would describe
Incredible. Where did we leave you off last before we went down?
Anyway, so the point of it is that I was taught that from an empirical psychology perspective, initially CBT is the best, and the sciences, and there's this whole kind of dynamic. And I come in, and then I start seeing people actually do it. And because I have a knack for it, I can immediately detect that, this person's good, this person's not. It doesn't really matter what language they're using. Yeah. So what up with that? Then I study the facts, science, and then you realize that the dirty little secret in the science is that common factors, really in relationships and process like that, that's where 95% of the action is. Okay. Now, interestingly, we alluded to one of our fifth and sixth questions. I don't remember exactly which one, but common factors, you don't really train common factors. You can't brand common factors. You can't build programs of research that says, cognitive behavior therapy should be funded by the NIMH and told everybody what to do. You don't just say, hey, great people should be funded. There's no brand there. There's no science. There's the boxes that people put in. So anyway, that's interesting. And that's exactly why, by the way, it's a brand battle. So I see this and I get introduced to what's called the psychotherapy integration movement. There's a movement.
It's a brand battle between the different schools, between the different
schools. Exactly. In fact, the first chapter in the book, my first book, I'm on my second book now, is called From Racing Horses to Seeing the Elephant. Okay. From racing horses, meaning you get into a school of thought and you put all your money on whoever the guru is, like Beck, that's running that horse, versus Rogers, versus Freud, versus Skinner, or whomever. Yeah. And then your task is to actually, support the school of thought. You bet on it and then you become it. As opposed to the elephant, which is the metaphor of the blind end and the elephant that you can actually see, they all have different parts on them, but there's a hole there. And our task really is to understand what the hole is rather than race ourselves into a particular part. So the system is set up to get socialized into that. I got into that, but not everybody. There's a group of psychotherapists that are interested in psychotherapy integration. Okay. In fact, I'm president-elect of this organization. Right now, I'll become president next year.
Nice.
But in 1994, then I got awakened to what's called psychotherapy integration. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I hope you don't mind that I keep interrupting you. I hope that's all right.
Oh God, I love this conversation. Whatever, Xavier. Whatever's alive for you. Absolutely.
Good. Can you just quickly tell us what are the racing horses today? What are the large competing brands, just to give us a lay of the field?
Yep. So there are, inside of individual level adult psychotherapy schools, there are 4, and really 2 of them get yoked together as primary. Okay. So the 4 are psychodynamic, that stems from Freud, right? Okay. Behavioral, which stems from Watson into Skinner and behavioral mods, humanistic, and cognitive. Okay. Those are the 4. Cognitive and behavioral, for complicated reasons, got fused together in what's called CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. Okay. So those 2 joined up. In many ways, those 2 then join up in relationship, in battle. So you get CBT, which are more empirical, rationalistic, supportive, cultivate adaptive change. And then you get psychodynamic and humanistic, which focus on relationships, emotion, insight, and the underlying aspects of the condition. So these are the major schools. There are a lot of other variants about that. And the one thing that I say, you can go underneath it at the levels of analysis to get into like computational neuroscience, and then psychiatry, which looks for broken biology, as its idea, and really alchemy. They were alchemists, basically, trying to sprinkle chemicals on the brain to manage symptoms. All right. And then you get this systems people, at family systems and other social systems, up into the sociological and justice angles. Okay, so like in terms of like, hey, multicultural, feminist, and other kinds of power relational dynamics. But that's so at the individual level, 4 great schools: cognitive, behavioral, humanistic, psychodynamic.
Thank you so much. I feel like part of this conversation for me is going to be a Psych 101, which is part of the pleasure of having these conversations. I get to learn so much from the best of the field. So thank you for sharing that.
So those are the 4. And what I realized then at 1994 is I realized, hey, to do psychotherapy, okay, I thought you would apply the scientific method. And I was like, but no, when you actually meet with somebody, you're in the real world, N of 1, okay, what you need to do is you need to then create that real world relationship and then extract the knowledge. But to do that, you have to have a schema, a theory that organizes. That's why everyone has their orientations, okay, because but you can't adjudicate between the orientations. Like all the orientations, they back up, they say reasonable things, but then they back up into fundamental assumptions that are all different. Okay. And so I'm a coherentist at a broad level. By the way, unity, coherence, consilience, all of these terms are a coherentist model basically says, hey, shit should make sense. That's what a coherentist says. You know, John would appreciate this. This is more a different angle on intelligibility and plausibility. Another way of thinking what the coherentist says, if you come in and hear lots of noise, you want to say, well, if you can tweak shit and get music, that's better. Like music makes more sense. Okay. So a seeker of unity is like, yeah. And that's essentially what my macro level mind is like. I'm hearing all these instruments playing different things, but when I listen to them as a whole, I just get noise. But my intuition was that actually there could be a great composer of understanding that would afford me the opportunity to align the instruments and cultivate music. That was my intuition. Okay. So, and then I needed that schematically. All right. So then I was like, well, then I made this other intuition, and you get a sense of it. So modern Western medicine, all right, which is the application of biological science for human betterment, that's modern Western medicine, okay, is relatively well organized. All right. We have all the organ systems, you know, you have your circulatory system and your reproductive system and all that. And they all break in various ways. Okay. And then we have doctors that try to fix them. But what are they all anchored to? They're anchored to the science of human biology. Okay. So the science of human biology creates the foundational understanding of the ground. Then we understand the systems of the biological systems. Then they break and we develop treatments for them. But the overarching architecture is the science of human biology. So my intuition was, well, wait a minute. The science of all these different schools of thought should be organized by the science of human psychology. Okay. Which, by the way, no one's ever made that link. As common sense as that is. No one's ever made that link in the way I made it. Okay. Because the way the link is made is not through theory, but through research. That's how many people make the link. It's like, well, yeah, it's through the science, but by the science, they mean the application of research methods, not the notion of theory. Okay. Not the theoretical architecture of human psychology. They mean it. So the link between science and practice is empirical, epistemological, hard work, like I did a suicide attempter study. I meant it as, the theory of human psychology. Okay. Well, punchline is nobody knows what the fuck psychology is. Turns out, okay, at the theoretical level. I didn't know this until this time, but this is what happens to me. Okay. So what do? I find what's called evolutionary psychology. Okay. Evolutionary psychology has just started to come on the field. It's a new field in the mid 1990s. I don't know if you ever heard of it. But evolutionary psychology is a field that starts to apply evolutionary theory to the domain of psyche, basically. Pretty straightforward. And it was a guy by the name of Edward Wilson, who you should know. Have you ever heard of Edward Wilson? Do you know Edward Wilson? Okay. Well, we'll share. I tell you about Edward Wilson. You'll like Edward Wilson in some ways. So in 1998, Edward Wilson writes a book called Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. Okay. And my unified is exactly in reference to his consilience. So consilience and unity, and seekers of unity and consilience. Consilience is so here's a scientist seeking consilience. Okay. And I'm a scientist, and you're a mystic seeking consilience, really. Okay. And psychology is going to exist, especially science of psychology, the practice of psychotherapy is like this place in between hard science, okay, and wisdom and brotherhood. Okay, so that's the linkage. So anyway, Edward, the reason I mentioned Edward Wilson is because he becomes famous for what's called sociobiology, and it's an evolutionary approach to social animal behavior that then has implications for humans. Gets all controversial. There's inside the academy, blah blah blah. The evolutionary psychologists pick up the baton from Edward Wilson, okay, repackage his ideas from sociobiology into evolutionary psychology. And in 1992, they have released the first major book on it called The Adaptive Mind. Okay, some people have done it. They get together, they launch a movement called The Adapted Mind in 1992. So this is now 1995 for me. I'm now at 1995. And this is catching fire as an idea. Okay, at least on the inner circles. And I pick it up. I'm like, of course, evolution provides the overarching. Okay, so I'm now going to then organize the different schools of thought through evolutionary psychology. And I read everything I can. I teach myself evolutionary theory, which I didn't understand. And I teach myself start to understand the evolution of thought and this whole approach called evolutionary psychology. Okay, all right. So this brings me up to 1996. Okay, 1996, it begins to dawn on me that evolutionary psychology is not up to the task. It's trapped in its own schools of thought. It basically merges the evolutionary horse, okay, with cognitive science. All right, but it does so in a way that essentially becomes defined against behaviorism and the cultural approaches. Okay. In other words, the way these two horses are yoked together and framed, they actually don't speak well with old behavioral theory, and they don't speak well with cultural process. Okay. So I need all of that. Okay. And it doesn't go well with human blah, blah, blah. And so I'm concerned about this in some ways. And then in 1996, I had my first insight near the end of 1996. Okay. And I don't have a flash of insight on this. This evolves over a couple of months. All right. And this is the insight that would become justification systems theory. Okay. What is that? I figured out with a lot more precision than anybody else has ever figured out what actually makes us human persons from when we were primates. Okay. So the trail from what we are as primates, okay, into what makes us persons, the justification systems theory fills in a unbelievably important piece of the puzzle that nobody had quite filled in before. Okay. I can get to the specifics of that, but basically what it says is people think in terms of language and culture, okay, and self-consciousness. Well, the process of justification yokes together the structure and function of our egoic self-consciousness, the nature and structure of our propositional language, and the systems that coordinate and legitimize human collective knowledge. All right. So like it juxtaposes three core pieces of the puzzle together and then places it on an evolutionary foundation. All right. And this was a game changer. In fact, I remember running to the evolutionary psych people, especially Lita Cosmides. She was leading. I was like, hey, I found this thing and it solves all these problems. And it was so interesting and weird in retrospect because I'm this emerging little, doctoral student genius who can figure shit out. I mean, I just happen to have this unbelievable talent for figuring this stuff out. And I was running to the people of the field. I was like, and they just would kind of get overloaded and they would see me as a quack and they were, oh, that's really interesting, and run away. Over and over and over again. People would be completely like deer in headlights and then make some judgment that I was a particular weirdo and then run away. So I saw that with a lot of reliability. That was a behavior pattern. At the time, I'm naive. I'm just I don't understand it. I have naive belief in the quest for truth. Okay. Yeah. But no, in retrospect, essentially what I was doing was I'm building the system that's actually going to assimilate and integrate everybody else's ideas into one idea, which is the last thing fucking academics want. They do not want that, the basic issue, So anyway, I find this point and I'm like, well, wait a minute. If we think in terms of the evolution of justification systems, okay, that gets hooked into humanity like 100,000 years ago, Now we can then say that, hey, these justification systems evolve. That's cultural evolution. And that connects to the whole thing. And we can separate out animals and persons, which, by the way, evolutionary psychology doesn't do at all. Doesn't actually have a language to do that. Okay. So I work on this for a year and I'm like, I'm super psyched. I'm like, this is my thing. Okay. I figured out this, figure out what it is that makes humans unique in relation. People have been struggling with that for a while. That's a big fucking deal. I'm like, oh my God. So my experience in the world now starts to get launched in 1996. Okay. Like all of a sudden. All right. And then I get qualitatively launched on a August to September evening in 1997. Okay. 1997, I start smoking weed. I'm up in Vermont. People, wandering around. Okay. And then I realized my weed smoking, that actually elevates my creativity in a particular way. And then I end up systematizing this into my entire work structure. But one night, I don't know exactly the date, but it's definitely between August and September of 1997. I have the original. I'm drawing out, and I draw out 4 cones. Okay. The 4 cones, the tree of knowledge, what will become the tree of knowledge. I draw a circle at the bottom for the Big Bang, and then out of that comes matter as a cone. And then out of the matter comes life, and then out of life comes mind, and out of mind comes culture. Okay. And I drew 30 seconds, drew all those things, and essentially every cell in my body was transformed in relationship to that schematic from that point on. It was just absolutely 30 seconds. And my entire life was changed. Yeah.
It sounds almost like it sounds almost like a religious awakening of sorts.
Totally. In fact, I talk in the second part of the thing I did with John on the higher orders of consciousness, the 11th problem of consciousness. This is the example I use. So I had a complete transformative experience in relation. And I told John, although the interesting thing about my experience, unlike many, because he will talk then about the self-world perspectival right hemispheric grip. Okay. Basically the generalized shift that somebody has. And I was like, John, the cool thing about my scenario, I came through logos. I am drawing basically a logical line. I know what every one of these fucking variables are. And it said Big Bang, quantum mechanics, and general relativity. I'm not anchored to anything other than fundamental mathematical physics here. Okay. And the system now affords me, and I've been figuring out exactly what all the specifics are, but the gestalt popped, and it was a really weird experience. Okay. Really weird over the next year. I have to go into therapy around this because weird shit starts happening. To give you an idea of what it meant to me, I hid the diagram for a while, hid it. Okay. And put on it, do not repeat or reproduce. No, I would occasionally show it to somebody. Okay. My weird phenomenology, this is how weird it was for me, was that it was so apparent to me that this was such an unbelievably new formulation, was that I thought somebody else could see it and steal it. Okay. Because what it afforded me a way of seeing the universe that was as concrete as like a car outside. Okay. If you were here in my house and I walked out and said, well, there's a red car in the driveway, you'd be able to see the red car in the driveway. You get into it, drive it around. It's not hard. My phenomenological experience was that those 4 cones allowed me to see the entirety of the universe with a level of concreteness and specificity that's akin to that car. And somehow I projected that ability into other people. And I then thought that other people could then see that this was the car formula for the universe. And if they would be able to take it. So that's interesting. That's the phenomenological experience of what I had in relationship to this. And then I found I can't give the goddamn thing away.
People must have thought you were crazy.
Totally. I'm regulated and I'm a clinician, so I know I can empathize with other people. Like we started with the crack thing. It's not hard for me to empathize. Thank God. If I was somebody that didn't have good, I'm sure a lot of people actually end up going insane, of course, right? If you didn't know and you had, talk a lot, there's some paths to insanity, if I didn't have a regulation so I could empathize with why everyone would see me as insane, I would have gone insane. I would have been very, very difficult. It was difficult, but I've trained as a clinician so I know why people are going to see this as insane, or at least create a holding environment, understand that metabolization and maintain regulation and relation. But there were definitely times it was sort of like, what the, So, because you then ask this question, I mean, am I crazy?
Right. That was my follow-up question. I wanted to know,
totally.
were there ever, this is a personal question, was there ever moments where you did feel like you were crazy, or like there was some sort of, I mean, having yourself study, insanity and delusion and detrimental behavior, was there any point where it's like, wow, maybe I've become that thing which I was studying all these years?
So, yes, in one sense. I never, so there's different kinds of crazy. Okay. My primary fear was that the best path to explain it is that I have some narcissistic desire. And there are some issues in relationship to my father. We could get into the dynamics of my father, to need to be a genius. There's an argument. I've certainly uncovered the shadow and the idea that maybe this is a need to be genius projection, so that I grossly exaggerate the novelty of it, the brilliance of it, the clarity of it. Okay. And where really it's not all that special. And I over specialize it because of my egoic narcissistic need. All right. So there was definitely, the best theory for it was a personality shadow disorder kind of deal. And I say that because I never go crazy. I mean, there's never any point in which I'm like anywhere near. I get some hypomanic stuff. Okay. But I'm about there's different dimensions that make you vulnerable to psychoses. When I'm stoned, you can see that I have some of those dimensions, but my normal, regular Gregg state is about as opposite as a schizophrenic, like looseness, as you can, and the capacity to be grounded and attend to the reality of the shared understanding of our collective, and be able to have that all network together in relation. That's my base state, is that. So I was never close to any kind of like Langian psychotic episode where I would actually have a break from reality, because I've always been very, very grounded in that. So the line was, "Hey, Gregg, this is an egoic narcissistic function and this I deal with my dad some, because he's a professor. He's like, well, what do the experts say?" I mean, this was, and my prediction was, well, actually, if I showed it to an expert who had the capacity to see this, they would obviously see this as brilliant. And that turned out to be wrong. I was wrong about that. I made that crystal clear prediction. And then it started happening, so that no.
Yeah. So I want to ask why that turned out to be wrong. And I know that's something that you've given thought to as well, and something we discussed last time. I'm curious, and I don't mean at all to psychologize or to be in the seat that you definitely know the field better than ever I will. But in terms of you mentioned some of the paranoia that came from being stolen. Do you think over there may have been some paranoia is typically, as far as I understand, indicative of a detachment with reality? I mean, that's the difference between paranoia and fear, where it's an unjustified fear. Was there a sense ever of the paranoia, or was that maybe just connected to the weed, which can also trigger paranoia? I understand.
Right. So it wasn't really a paranoid idea, though. In retrospect, it looks like it. And the reason, so paranoia at the it's like, oh my God, I discovered this recipe. It's really important. If I never showed it to somebody and knew for sure that they would steal it if I did, and never tested that wouldn't be paranoid. Okay. It's not that paranoid to say, hey, I see that this is an equation, the equivalent of an equation. And my only assumption, actually, it's a non-egoic assumption, is that it's not like I have some genius. It just is the equation. Somebody else can steal it. Okay. That's not in retrospect, and especially I think I've been basically validated. Like I saw it, I was right. I projected that other people could see it. It's not like I assumed I was 30 years ahead of my time, which it turns out that I was. Okay. So the interesting thing, and then as I showed it to other people, then I changed my behavior. In other words, I was like, that's wrong. Okay. And then I told my dad, I was like, well, if I sat down and explained it to them, then I would be able to convince them. I bet you that. And then I lost that bet. There was no way. So reality grounded is the difference between, you have a hypothesis, a scientist then has a hypothesis and gathers additional data and decides whether and I always would change my behavior in relationship to the data. So that's what I would not call it. It was a paranoid reaction initially, and we can kind of chuckle at it, but it was actually grounded in a particular kind of logic, which most paranoids are, but it wasn't a closed delusion in the sense that I was very much open to feedback. And as I saw other people not react, my behavior changed fairly radically.
Yeah. So you're reacting with the reality based on what's unfolding, what's unfolding for you about reality. Tell us then about this prediction of yours that fails, and why in retrospect you feel like it fails.
Well, right. This has been a fascinating thing. So for me, okay, the idea that you can, the analogy for me is this: when Newton shines the white light through the prism, he sees the refraction. For me, the tree of knowledge is like a prism for the universe. You look through it and you see a wave of material, a wave of living, a wave of mental, and a wave of cultural behavior. All right. And then emergent out of Big Bang. So out of an energy information singularity. So we start with energy information. And then God, the finger of God, starts the transformation. And then we get the Spinoza's nature unfolding before us. And it starts at the material level of frequency. And then in our particular line, 4 billion years ago, it jumps into a life level of frequency. And then 700 million years ago, it jumps into a beginning mind level of frequency. And then 100,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, it starts a cultural level of frequency. And then that level of frequency is now here. And I'm a complex observer looking back on time that has the first finalized map that allows me to find the ground of matter through life, through mind, through culture, and through the complex observer to see the whole thing. I mean, that's what it affords. And I was just amazed that so many people had simultaneous reactions of, wow, that's really interesting, of, wow, that's unsurprising, of, wow, well, it's sort of right, but sort of wrong. I mean, it's just as a cluster of different reactions. But not, oh my God, that's definitely right. I'm going to devote my whole life to figuring out what that means. Okay, that's never the only I had that reaction initially, at least.
Let me just get clear. The basic premise that life emerges from matter, what we refer to as abiogenesis, and that animals, therefore, complex organisms evolve from life, and then humans somehow branch off from that. That in itself doesn't seem so radical to me. What maybe I'm
totally. No, in fact, you're having exactly the right response. Okay, so when I send it to like Dan Dennett, he gave me a one-word response: unsurprising. Okay, if you don't know how to look at it, one very common response is, well, that's just a map of big history. Everybody already knows that.
Right.
Okay, so it took me a little while to learn. So it can fall under what is already old knowledge, and then you project that this guy's a quack. That's like. But of course, like, obviously, I know about big history. It's not like
right.
What's remarkable, if you actually pay attention to it, what's remarkable is that the joints, the joints, that's what you have to pay attention to. And what it says with an enormous amount of specificity is I can now ontologically specify what mind is. And I figured out meta theories that afford me an opportunity to define mind, both at the level of animal and at the level of human. Okay, so in retrospect, what it is like, oh, there's the evolutionary synthesis. That was arguably the biggest discovery in the 20th century, which is the merger of Darwin's theory of natural selection with genetics that gave us a joint point between life and matter. I come along and figured out the joint points between life and mind and culture, so I can actually specify what I mean by the mental field ontologically with an overarching descriptive metaphysics that's grounded in physics, and then give meta theories that afford us what we mean by the animal mental and the cultural person. And all of a sudden, the whole system starts to sing with a degree of clarity that we were completely missing, as I learned when I was trying to do psychotherapy integration, and nobody had any framework for the human mental behavior that was actually afforded the capacity to assimilate and integrate the insights into some music. That's what but I could see that. Other people couldn't see that.
Yeah. So I want to do something which might be interesting here, which is, and the audience, I hope will forgive me for this, which I want to jump over the explication of that point that you've just laid out, which as far as I can remember, the term that you use is the justify self. What's just the term that you use?
The justification systems
theory.
Yes,
justification systems theory
between mind and culture.
Okay, so in that link specifically. So instead of getting into the specificities of that, because I know that will take us a good half an hour at the very least, I want to ask you have these two sides of the reaction. One of them is like, no duh, of course this is happening, which once you've added those links, there is something now which is new, which is being added. And then there's still rejection, and the rejection now is a different form of rejection. It's not a rejection of, hey, this is obvious, it's a rejection of...
Right. So, okay. So, right. So then there's the problem of obviousness, and then the problem of how to, now I get into, this is sort of my story, and why I'm here talking to you out as a lifelong academic. Okay. And that basically the economy does not know how to metabolize this. So here's what happened. So by 1998, 1999, maybe 2000, I shared it with enough people. So it's like, now I know I can't give it away. And even individual explanations don't afford me light bulbs and powerful people that I wanted. Okay. Beck was most interested in it when he hired me. And then I tried to explain this to him, and he would check out. Okay. I was at the University of Pennsylvania working with Beck on the suicide attempters. That was my day job. And my night job was then cultivating this. Okay.
What's Beck's first name?
Aaron Timken Beck.
Okay, so if anyone wants to look him up, they have his full name.
Right. Aaron Beck is, it's hard to find. He's still alive at 100, a Jewish chap.
Right.
And a fascinating character, and somebody I have mixed feelings about, but I love Beck overall. But anyway,
he should less than 120, as we say in our circles.
Yes, he's less than 120. I wonder how he's doing these days. I haven't talked to him in about a couple of years. Anyway, so yeah, I'm working with, my day job is that, and then my night job. Okay, and then I figure out a way in 2001. I'm talking now. I'm out, in at least telling people about this and making the case, and I'm learning how to make the case. And over a period of time around 2001, 2002, I figure out that I can now frame the joint point argument. Okay. And frame the joint point argument is that behavioral investment theory, that's the thing that goes from life to mind. Okay. It's the third key idea, assimilates B.F. Skinner's the behaviorist, okay, to mainstream. So I take B.F. Skinner behaviorism and merge it with cognitive neuroscience. Okay, in other words, the brain, John's expertise is a cognition. Okay, so you take John, take B.F. Skinner, take neuroscience, you put it on an evolutionary foundation. That's called behavioral investment theory, to explain the animal mental complex adaptive behavior patterns. Okay. And that's what behavioral investment theory does. And then I was like, I'll take Freud's key insight, not Freudian psychoanalysis, but Freud's key insight, which is what? We have animalistic urges, okay? We live in a socio-cultural environment that prescribes what we ought to do, and our psyche manages the tensions between that with an id and justifying ego and a superego that regulates, okay? Well, the main thing about justification systems theory is that it takes Freud's key idea and explains it evolutionarily. It's like, oh, this is why. Because the ego evolves as a mental organ of justification to navigate what's justifiable in the social environment and your animalistic id impulses. So it's a theory of the ego that Freud didn't have. Okay. So in 2003, ultimately, I then published The Tree of Knowledge System and the Theoretical Unification of Psychology in Review of General Psychology, which was a new book, new journal, but a decent, solid, and perfect home for it journal. It's a general psychology. And I get it published. And I'm like, all right, woohoo! There's no way that anyone can deny that this is an unbelievable upgrade in organizing all of our theory. This is going to put me on the map. And I'm also now, I actually moved from University of Pennsylvania. I get hired in my current job at James Madison University. It's all interesting story there. Actually where I went as an undergrad, but into this really unique program. Okay. And then I think that, well, with this publication now, this is going to completely launch me. Fine. You can't do one-on-one, but the field has got to deal with this now.
Great. You put it now in a peer-reviewed journal. It's gold standard. It's out for anyone to see.
Ready to go. And I have because I work with Beck and we've been publishing a few other things. I now have an emerging name. Okay. And I got like 3 emails on it. I couldn't, I was like, it just sat there, sat there in the institution. And I was like, but then I got an opportunity, okay, but for a complicated set of reasons, a guy at the Journal of Clinical Psychology who was afraid of the article at first, I learned, but then he sat him down, talked to him about it. Then he was like, oh my God, this actually makes perfect sense. You should do a special issue on it. And then another good journal of Clinical Psychology. And that actually grew into 2 special issues, December 2004 and January 2005 of Journal of Clinical Psychology. I engage a bunch of people. and then have 2 special issues on this thing about how it solves the problem of psychology. Okay. Psychology Defined, part 1 and 2. All right. And it has like 18 commentaries from leaders in the field. It has 5 additional articles from other people and a beginning and end article from me. It's a major accomplishment. And you get 2 special issues of the journal. Okay. And it does carry a little bit of conversation. I get some notoriety, some attention, but basically nothing happens. Okay? I try to then create an opportunity for conferences, which I have in 2007, 2008. I get some money. I bring people in. We have conferences of about 50 people called Visions of Integration. All right. And people get together. That's the theme. We bring some leaders in. There's a conversation about it. But the short answer is the system fails to do anything. It doesn't do anything. And that was a fascinating reality. It just doesn't do anything. People find it somewhat interesting. I obviously am now established. I actually get another special issue in the Journal of Theory and Psychology in 2008. I have conferences, but there's no traction. There's no mechanism that affords the thing to move forward, which was fascinating. I really to this day, this was another bet I lost. So I was like, well, once I got this, and then once I got everybody, and then clearly it's got to take off after these conferences. These are, relatively major people coming together to have conversation. This thing's on record now if it operates in a particular way. And nope, it didn't do anything. It just led to a conversation. There was nothing that resulted in any production, which was fascinating.
Is that it seems like you're saying that the system itself had a flaw in that it itself didn't afford production.
Totally. Well, there's my problem and the system's problem. So let me own my problem. Okay. The goddamn thing is way too complicated. Okay. I built it on my own. It's a freaking cathedral. All right. And you actually have to, I realized that essentially what I did is construct a whole new language, first for psychology and really then for philosophy. So it's like you have to learn a whole new language to actually speak it with a degree, which nobody really wants to do.
Yeah. It's a high item.
No.
Yeah.
So it's high, but you have to then see it. You have to then start to learn it, and you have to then believe in it in a way that then elevates me in a particular kind of way, which is weird. Okay, this guy's like some seer, and we actually need to learn the specifics of what this guy's insight was. So it almost becomes sort of like this religious thing. And I do have a narcissistic angle we can talk a little bit about, but humility. John scores very high on the virtue of humility. I have lots of virtues, but one that I've been working on over the last decade is humility, and that's not a virtue. That's why I have the chutzpah to call it the tree of knowledge system, which some people just loathe. They're like, what the hell? What are you saying? I was like, oh, it's called to call it that. That's what it is. And that's true. And I'm glad I did. But that's, the tree of knowledge system and the theoretical unification that yokes together Skinner and Freud, aligns them with Darwin and Einstein, and solves the problem of science writ large. I mean, people, people have no idea how to interact with that on an egoic level. Okay, yeah. That's weird. And actually also it then essentially requires them to actually swallow the ego and start to learn the language in terms of how it speaks. Okay. The system has the other thing that's really problematic. So that's me, and I'm sorry, and blah, blah, blah. And it's too much for the ego. The second thing, the system actually, what it says is psychology took a wrong turn foundationally. Yeah. Okay. The institution now has committed itself in the wrong way. And I can talk about but it basically decided that the problem of psychology, meaning we don't know what we are, doesn't matter. We can get around it through applying the methods of science, which is wrong. Okay. But that's what the system committed to. And I'm basically saying, no, you guys screwed up. 100 years ago when you had all this problem, that was actually a real weakness. The reason we're a soft science is because we're really confused. And until we get outside of our confusion and get coherence and clarity, we're going to keep just creating research programs that are like sandcastles in the sand. And that's what, and essentially what I'm now I just told all the power brokers in the field that you're basically building sandcastles, and I found the real thing. So the system is like,
I'm sure they were delighted to hear that. I'm sure they were just
all the elders that want to hear that there's some crazy 27-year-old white guy of all people that comes along and basically is like, no, I solved this problem. And the system, and that is the system that I found is actually, it is committed to institutional production. It's committed to methods of production. It's a capitalist labor system, basically. So it doesn't, I thought that the universities would still be at a place where they cared about the truth. Right. So, okay, ego and production, but actually, if you believe in foundational truth arguments, like you screwed this up, here's the problem, here's the solution, like that simple, like the system would actually have the capacity to metabolize that and wake up to that argumentation. That's what I was taught, and it's wrong. The system is not committed to truth. No, they don't give a shit. Individuals, the overarching architecture is a herd structure for capital labor production. And I've proven that over and over again.
Yeah, Greg, this is turning out to be a fascinating conversation, and one which I definitely did not expect to take this direction. And what's fascinating, perhaps even beyond just your own individual story, which is a fascinating one, is sort of taking it as a case study for the attempts to try and change ways of thinking in others, in institutions, in cultures, in religions. I know that a lot of the work that I'm engaged in, a lot of work that my friends are engaged in, my interlocutors and colleagues, is about trying to find old paradigms that are also new paradigms and bringing them to change the way that we think about things in ways that are challenging, that are upsetting the systems, the status quo before us. I'm curious, kind of from your years of going through this, and I know that this is not the end of your journey. We've only stopped at an arbitrary point because in 2011 you go on to publish a new unified theory of psychology with Springer, and so this is not something that you've given up pursuing. I'm curious to know, sort of retrospectively, looking back, your desire to the fact that you find something new and that it enlivens you beyond words is undeniable, and I think that even comes across today, decades later. Taking that information and wanting to have an impact with it and wanting to change minds and therefore change the world about it, is there any part of you which regrets ways that you went about it? I know that you began to very honestly mention aspects of ego or megalomania which may have gotten in the way, and we spoke about that before in your own journey with that, but less from the personal side. And sort of, I'm very curious in the methods of persuasion at an individual level and at a grand level. Do you feel like perhaps there was a detriment, that it served to your detriment to present it as a grand theory instead of bringing it in via research and empiricism? Do you feel like it? I'm curious to know your reflections in sort of in a broad thinking in that regard.
Right.
And as a psychologist as well, this insight will be very fascinating.
That's a beautiful question, and multiple. As we'll often get when you hear ask me questions, I have multiple feelings depending on what I want to aspectualize in relationship to it. So, at a pragmatic level, the answer is of course. At some level, there are lots of things I could have done to be in more accordance with the system and be in a zone of proximal development. And I did try to do some of those things, definitely. So it wouldn't be wrong to say that I wasn't aware of that or wasn't at least partially inclined, okay? And it's absolutely correct that there were paths available to me that I could have invested in, that I could see that would, start to seed a mode of production and replication and generation of this thing that would then be able to carry it forward.
Yeah.
Okay. My soul wouldn't let me, and I'm actually really thankful. Okay, because what happens to the system, this is before the tree of knowledge and the theoretical unification is one part of the system.
Yeah.
Okay. If I had slowed this down at this juncture, this 1996, 1997, okay, I wouldn't have had the whole second side of this thing that happens in 2017. Okay. And I wouldn't have gotten to knowledge. Okay. I maybe, and I certainly saw the outline of it, but I developed the garden into the coin, okay? The garden into the coin, and those things, if I were back into the system, I never would have, I would have been, it's because I stayed outside and kept zooming back and felt, and really, I didn't, will to attention is a particular structure. So you can what are you going to focus your attention on? Well, you have to control the will in a particular way. My will, at the cellular level, you felt that obsession, it's bottom up. I can fight against it some, but then it has to be a Kantian battle between, oh, Gregg, this is what you ought to do versus what your soul tells you. No, that is the light that you're shining towards. And I basically have always been like, I've always trusted my sense and had a pretty good attachment grounding, and basically like, no, I'm very autonomous. And it's like, no, that's right for me. So my mind will force me to think this way because what my intuition calls is, you can't control your thoughts. Your thoughts power themselves upon you in a particular kind of way.
Yeah.
And my soul is aligned with those thoughts. So it would have been just labor and annoyance and nails on chalkboard and things like that. And I knew I wasn't quite, in retrospect, I basically realized I wasn't done until 2017, 2018, where I have a whole nother sort of a layering of the thing through the coin in the garden. And then that becomes just, then it becomes a unified theory of knowledge. And that's like, and now I'm outside and thankfully, I maintain, I get associate professor and tenure, and then I get full professor, and I'm director of program. So my day job remains. I still always, I have a family. I've married my high school sweetheart. I have 3 kids in a single family home. So I do the Joneses kind of deal. I am doing my day job, and I'm just like, I am on to something here, and I can't let it go.
Right. We don't want to give anyone the impression that you're some sort of madman, genius recluse who has eaten mac and cheese for the past 2 decades. Although I'm sure there's elements of that as well.
Listen, I know my family right now knows that I'll often say, well, I'm a shaman on a hill. I definitely have some of that, but I have three lovely kids and a lovely wife and a little job, and live in Stewart's Raft, Virginia, doing my little thing, mowing my lawn. So it's at one level, it's fairly standard.
Yeah, and I'm sure. I don't want to presume, but I'm sure you find a lot of satisfaction from the quotidian, from your children. And
of course. If I did, I've always been. I'm actually basically a feminine caretaking heart. I always wanted a family, and it was always the natural path for me at this level. I just this in 26, from when 24 to 27 or whatever, this whole nother meta side of me got pried into and then exploded.
Yeah, there's also, of course, there's a relationship between the shaman and the feminine dad, who was Gregg. Do you mind actually just showing the audience the mug that you have in front of you that your daughter made for you?
Yes, this is my daughter, Lainey. In 2016, so she would have been 11, 12. I started on the garden. I had a light bulb moment. There was another light bulb moment in the garden. And she actually has she'd helped me with a lot of the color of that.
Very cool.
And built the garden, just, and part of the actual calling was I envisioned we could do a nursery school in the garden. The whole idea of the visual platform is like, actually you could build an entire trees, garden, bees, kind of structure for kids, and then have the symbolism built in, and then have it revealed to them at whatever level, all the way up through, through the sage, basically.
Wow, fascinating. I'm curious. I'm thinking now about sort of the who was it? The Waldorf, the anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, the way that he's also managed to another sort of polymath and genius who also wanted to really create a full system around that. I'm curious to know. I want to ask this question from a place of love, and a place of sort of, if I can look into my own future a little through your backwards eyes, because we're sort of two modes upon this continuum of time that you're a bit further down the line from me, but I do feel affinities in terms of these desire for these grand picture thinkings this is the question which I want to know about you and also about perhaps me, and I'm gonna, maybe the best way to phrase it like this: do you feel that, when you reach the end of your life, when you're on your deathbed, that it would have been better to, not indicating that you're anywhere near there, and you should live for many, many happy, healthy years until then. I'm not, no one's wishing that upon you, but eventually one day when you get there, do you feel like you would have been satisfied in your life retrospectively, more by pursuing the truth to its full extent and unfolding into the garden and the coin and all the incredible work you've done, or having stopped at some point in terms of your own pursuit after the truth as you were able to see it, and instead sort of compromised in that exploration and invested those energies instead to taking the little bit of truth that you discovered and working on sharing that with other people? Is that a fair question? Like,
Yeah.
is the full truth that we find on our own more satisfying, or is it the little truth that we're able to share with others?
That's a really, in my own retrospect, if I could really see two different paths. Of course, I don't know what the other path was.
Sure.
But as it turned out, there's no hesitation. Thank God I took the path I did. So I'm, but I say that with hesitation because it's certainly very plausible. Here's another thing that's plausible, okay, is that I'm so in love with this, I'm so pursuing it. I could have found originally what it was, okay, and felt that there was more, but there wasn't. And then that would have been an error. And you don't know when you're there, okay? So you can feel that, I want to keep. The fact that I discovered the garden and the coin to round it out in a particular way, well, then those things. I mean, in my world, those things are priceless. Those are, and so to have the tree and then to have a whole nother layer on top of that affords me the opportunity to, I grab the tree and then I get back to the garden. That's just, I have more wealth than Bezos. There's nothing that's more valuable in the world than that to me. And that's just, so I could never say, well, maybe I should have gone another. Thank God I found the path I did. That's my little soul. But that's a complicated thing. So it just speaks to what my obsession is and how I value it. And I feel unbelievably fortunate, aligned with the transcendent through this thing. That's my experience. And ergo, I'm just thankful for whatever forces there are in the world that my energy information baton got aligned in this particular path.
Yeah, that's firstly, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that it has been fulfilling for you. I mean, the last thing you said, that it's afforded you to feel aligned with the transcendent, is an idea which, I mean, goes back all the way to Aristotle, and I don't know whether that was intentional in when you said it or not, but a lot of the work of the mystic, which I hope to get into at some point later, is, and you know this from John as well, is to align ourselves with the intelligibility of the universe, and that's definitely something which is an ends in itself, and it's not a means to an end. And the sense of being wealthier than Bezos is something which I can resonate with. And in my own sort of quest, who knows where life takes me, but I'm sort of after a grand theory of mysticism to sort of make coherence of the field in itself. And the challenge is that in that pursuit, and this is going to link us back to one of the previous questions we asked. Actually, I don't know if we're going to get to all 5, because it looks like we've been going for about an hour and a half, and I think we should cap this at about 2 hours, give or take a little. But I think the question which I want to come back to is that in my own thinking, I'm very much driven by how do these thoughts help someone else? Firstly, how do they help me transform to be a better person, a kinder person, a more patient, tolerant, understanding person? And how do I help someone else? And you mentioned very eloquently how this search for you began literally in the therapy room. And I want to know this theory. How do you see it having application? How has it had application to come back to helping real people, yourself in your own life, in your own relationships, and also as a clinician and as a professional? I would really love to know that.
Beautiful. Okay. So this is my day job. So I get hired as a professor of psychology in the combined integrated doctoral training program, where my job, I become director of that for 12 years. I've been there since 2003. I'm a full professor in that program. And that is producing doctoral level psychologists who go out and help people across the lifespan. Okay. So just so that people know, my day job is a psychological healer. Okay. So that I'm very interested and concerned in relationship to that. And what I want to do is I want to extract the wisdom of our field, both our science, the humanistic philosophical reflections that the field affords, and ultimately how it can also potentially then bridge into other wisdom traditions and clarify what nourishes the soul and spirit. And I don't think the current structure of psychology is well structured to do that, by the way. Okay. It needs to appreciate you, and it doesn't. I'll say that. Okay. Meaning that it doesn't know how to hold even the concepts of soul and spirit. Okay. And that's sad at some level. So it gives rise to a narrative and a reductive empiricism that actually I think potentially crushes the soul. Okay. And I'm basically a pretty big critic of both psychiatry in particular, okay, and clinical psychology and its structure. So and we can get into why. So I think it's feeding people the wrong things. I also believe that there are foundational principles that it could feed us that don't nourish us, and that although I used to be and am oriented as a psychological doctor, these are generalizable principles. And in fact, in 2 days, I give up my clinical license after 25 years. So June 30th is my last day as a licensed psychological doctor. And I'm giving it up because I'm turning into a public intellectual, okay? And I believe that we are facing a meta-psychological problem. All right. John in the meaning crisis. So I used to talk about the mental health crisis, and they're very closely related.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, I see us having 4 great crises, sort of meta crises. There's the environmental crisis. Okay. So that's the nuclear weapons, CRISPR, the damage we do to the environment, the power that technology does and what it does to Mother Earth. That's one. The craziness of the digital virtual environment that's emerging and what it does, what it means in terms of both our potential, but threatening all the old institutions. And we have to get that. There are people that need to understand that, not me. I'm on the other side of mental health and meaning, the human condition. Okay. And the fact of the matter is that all the wisdom traditions built what John would call psychotechnologies for the soul and spirit.
Yes.
Okay? And the science of psychology has no idea how to relate to those at all. Okay. At least the way it's structured in mainstream. The unified theory knows how to relate to them. Okay. And that's a big deal. I mean, imagine what it would be if we had a unity that afforded us a way to think about mysticism, spirituality, and the science of psychology in terms of what populates the American university structure. They don't even know how to talk about the word soul and spirit, let alone actually, we're always like, what about spirituality? Oh my God, it's a nightmare. So one broad level picture is, hey, what are we being fed? My argument is that it doesn't feed us in a particular way. Now you could say, is there actually practical on the ground thing that the system affords? And the answer is yes. And I'd be happy to get into that. But I wanted to make a first comment that says, hey, think about the way where our knowledge systems are currently organized, and then think about what a massive rotation it would be if actually psychology was effectively arranged so that it actually could distill, cultivate, nourish the wisdom traditions of other elements to show what a fulfilling human life is, and how to build that bridge.
Yeah, that's a beautiful vision. I mean, just saying it seems like an inspiring, hopeful thought. Let me ask you, as a total novice and layperson, the place that spirituality, wisdom traditions, in a broad sense, play already in-depth psychology and humanistic psychology. I'm thinking people like Jung and Maslow and what happens with the human potential movement when humanism kind of meets spirituality at the Esalen and all that, which I'm sure you're well aware of. I just as a layperson, a lot of Fritz Perls, a lot of Erich Fromm, a lot of Maslow, where they do get into higher states of consciousness and peak experiences and the dehumanization that we're decrying here. Is it something which they missed? Is it something which what's your thoughts?
No, actually, I use the word scientific psychology there, okay, for purpose. Those guys are not really, they're in the humanistic psychology.
I see.
So humanistic psychologists get it. Okay?
I see.
Humanistic psychology is the intersection of philosophy and practice, and often coming off of either the humanistic or psychodynamic traditions. Okay. The scientific psychology, at least up until this point, although it's starting to wobble because the system just doesn't work, is anchored to the cognitive behavioral sciences.
I see. Okay. I see. Okay. That's a helpful clarification. And just sort of stepping back a little, the humanists, broadly speaking, to include all of them in that umbrella, what is there something which they didn't do enough for you? Is there something that you felt was lacking there?
Well, they had a lot of good insights, definitely. And so you could, the problem is there's the coherence problem. Okay. So the coherence problem is like, okay, what is a natural science account of psychology? that then goes into human psychology, that then goes into the human application of psychology. Okay, that affords the capacity for coherence. That's the trick that I see is missing. So, for example, you and John, the most recent, you did one on describing transcendental states from a cognitive science perspective, and then you very carefully said, well, now we're going to justify the prescription of cognitive science states. Okay. The system has no idea how, to get a descriptive account of cognitive behavioral neuroscience, which is at the level of the animal, by the way, okay, things with brains, into the human, okay, at a descriptive explanatory count, and then effectively bridge that over into lived real experience that's informed by an ethic of ought. Okay. That's a shit show of confusion in relation. Okay, there is no. That's what I talk about. What's called the Enlightenment gap. The Enlightenment gap is a broken structure of understanding that affords us natural science over here, and then broken, fucked up social sciences, and then the humanities, and then it's all this chaotic. Okay, and psychology spreads across all those three. So, but I will use the term scientific psychology to tie it to the natural sciences, okay, and that bridge is key, but the field is broken. So yes, Fromm and Maslow and all of these kinds of people make very key insights. Many of them are absolutely I agree with, and then you assimilate and integrate them with a new system that actually goes all the way into biology, chemistry, and physics with coherence. That's what the issue is.
I see the difference. Yeah, I'm just looking at my list of questions here, and there's so many which we're not going to get a chance to get into, but I'm sure this won't be the last conversation we have together, God willing.
No, I hope not.
I want to take the chance to sort of dovetail from what we just spoke about and end with this final question. I promise it will be the last one. It's going to be the question naturally. I mean, so my interest is fundamentally in mysticism, a philosophical exploration of mysticism on a global level. Mysticism, defined in a slogan as the art of union with reality, is from Evelyn Underhill, which is, I think, really great. It's not a scholarly definition. There's a lot more precise scholarly definitions, which we hope to do a series on that at the channel. But in terms of one of the, at least the psychological ways that we refer to mysticism, that me and John and I have been speaking about, is as the transformative experiences that are afforded by higher states of consciousness, which is beginning to sound like a scientific description. And you had a fascinating insight that you had messaged me about, where your theory has something to say about these states of transcendence and how that works into what's classically known as ego death. And I would love if you'll be able to explicate what ego death means for you in your system. Beautiful.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what the self into ego is, okay? And then we can identify the ego as a sort of separate, but an add-on to the self. If you're familiar with Jung at all, Jung uses these terms in pretty similar ways, okay? So John Vervaeke and I just spent a lot of time syncing up on what I would call the experiential self. When we talk about the nature and function of the self, the first thing is the way the self builds a model essentially of itself and extends across time. And that's operating at the level of the primate, okay? So 500,000 years ago, with broken language, individuals would have a felt experience sense of the self, all right? But they wouldn't have a propositional knowledge system that is trying to then ask questions about and justify to oneself and into the world what they're trying to do, okay? The unified theory says language creates an opportunity for us to share information, opens us up. That's really great, okay? But it also forces us then to give accounts, because I can now ask you questions, all right? And the way you give accounts is tricky, okay? Here's a masculine example that I use, but it gets to the point really quickly, okay? So let's say you're an alpha male and you're pair bonded with somebody and you go off on a hunt, but I don't. I'm attracted to her, okay? I start going around hanging out with her, all right? You notice a pattern that every time you go back to the hunt, you come back and I'm hanging outside the hut. And you say, what are you doing, Gregg? Okay. If I just look at my thought processes and my desires, say, well, I hope to separate the two of you and take her as my mate. Okay. that other animals can't do that. But you have a window directly into my propositional thought system through the question. It goes right through my skin and doesn't lose informational form. Okay. So, and if I say that, then my influence in the world is brutalized. Okay. What does that mean? It means that nature has as an evolutionary problem. You have a problem here, and that is that you need an interpretive system that connects your animalistic thoughts to the socially acceptable environment. And that's called the ego. The ego is your mental organ of justification. Okay. And it's this add-on structure that basically adds a whole nother layer of mind, self-mind to us relative to the animal kingdom, especially because it's language. It creates all sorts of opportunities for cultural evolution and transmission, and you learn stuff, and we can transfer that to our kids in ways that other animals can't. So we then accumulate a history of justifications across contexts. Okay. And then your ego is you becoming a human person. And the person is that you can give accounts and take responsibility for what it is that you're doing. Okay. Well, then that system becomes a fundamental control system as you become an adolescent. Okay. As a young child, and from 6 to 7, you start to really become operating on the person plane. And by the time you're 13, bar bat mitzvah. Okay. You get a rite of passage, and now you're bringing, are you in the adult phase? Okay. Biologically, people start marrying off at that stage in the old days, right? Okay. So now what you have then is you have this interpretive ego function that's trying to justify your place in the world. Okay. And the set point is just, hey, thy mother, thy father, and thyself, and thy self-interest. And how do you justify what it is that you're doing? Okay. Well, then what happens to some people over time is the realization that this is contained. All right. What do I mean by that? It's like it dawns on you when you go from adolescence into sort of young adulthood, if you're at a particular capacity for meta reflection, it's like, well, why do I believe what I believe? Okay. And then the battle of do I matter? What's right? What are my beliefs in the system of justification that we sit in? Okay. Is a very complicated human dynamic. All right. What do I believe happens with the transcendent conditions? The higher states of consciousness basically shift from the constraints of rationality and self-interest justification into a fundamentally different perspective on self-interest propositional justification. Okay. That's not what it's about. The Tao is not the Tao, but it's the way of being in the world. In other words, it's not your rationalized justification, but actually it's the way of being. And what is the way of being? Down and above. Okay. It's a down and above frame of reference. And down and above relative to what? Relative to this level of egoic justification. All right. So fundamentally, what I would say is that basically what the sages recognized is that if we get trapped into narrow, reciprocal, self-centered, I'm better than you, what some of my would gain a kind of egoic justifications, that is exemplified by our former president, who would just basically, Trump would essentially embody this way of being. The wisdom traditions actually see that that's unbelievably toxic. There is no cooperative human system that can afford that. And it kills the environment. It kills the social environment. The ego is unbelievably toxic at that level. Okay. And there are lots of different ways in which you can get perspective on that thing so that you realize, oh my God, you have to go into the self, into ego, and then you have to kill the ego above and below.
How do you kill the ego above and below?
Well, I think that the transcendental states that people cultivate in a wide variety of there are all sorts of different, mystical traditions in relationship to, but they would all share that ultimate process of transforming, switching, turning off, eliminating, etc., reframing, whatever, the narrator. Okay. So whether Confucianism, as a more of a, not necessarily mystical, I don't know if I'm much about Confucianism, but the whole idea of Confucianism, expand the self to one. Okay. The Hindu traditions, the Buddhist traditions, no self and all this other, they're all different angles. What I would argue basically is the problem of the justifying self. Okay. As it tries to maintain its justified state of being and control and superiority of self-interest in a particular way.
Yeah.
Okay.
What is
the ways in which you might do that? Well, that's a fascinating question.
let me rephrase it then. that the self that's going the self that's undergone the death of the justifying self, operationally, what does that now look like in the world?
Well, that's a very well, what I think that the world has failed to do, okay, here's what I think. The modern world failed to appreciate this insight. We'll put it this way, okay? So it doubled down on logos justification, transcendental, egoic, ration reason, okay? And it emphasized propositional thought as the fundamental path through science, okay? So it lost insight in relationship to the importance of letting go of propositional knowledge and returning, to use John Vervaeke's term, to procedural and in particular perspectival participatory knowledge across this field that transcends self-interest. Okay? My argument would be that to the extent that actually we can find individuals that live in the world this way and have more of them, we will be in a lot better space. Okay. I mean, put every powerhouse and turn them into Trump, and I don't give us very much time at all. I mean, if all the leaders of China and Russia and everybody with nuclear bombs works like the world like Trump does, I don't find that we have much time. Okay, so for me, the issue is that look at the culture that John and Guy and you and people that, and I, whatever level of enlightenment we kind of want to claim and be humble at the same time and all this other stuff, but it's like, oh, the world is bigger than I am. Okay, we can love. We're actually one with the world. That suffering over there, that bird and its broken wing, hurts me in a particular way. I want to be a particular way that sees the unified field from the little position I have, but see oneness in relation above and below. Okay, so then the egoic system broadens to the point where it becomes diffuse. It also informs it at the level of, I think all the wisdom traditions articulate a particular appreciation for the participatory perspectival. The beauty of the unified theories actually comes through logos. Okay, it's like, oh, there was a way through logos to actually hit this thing and unify it rather than fracture it and then submit, as if like the physicists who say everything is just, energy at the quantum level. That's the only ontic reality there is. I mean, that's just insane, but we bow down. Oh my God, those guys don't know how to do calculus. It's like, it's just, So there's a world sickness in modernity that overemphasizes logos that's actually broken, incomplete. It doesn't nourish the soul, but in fact corrupts it. We see that in the mental meaning health process. The wisdom traditions from Hindu to Buddhism, Confucianism, and all, and Judaic, Kabbalah, etc. I got this. I mean, they understood this. They had to live in the world, in a particular way, and they found, a non-propositional path. Of course, then you had to make sense, and of course, there you go. All the goddamn ways of making sense out of it. But fundamentally, they knew what it was like to be resonant across the field, oneness. And the systems found that way. And the justifying egoic, oh my God, what about me on my little narrow band of what my preferences are and what my egos are and what all that other stuff, they're like, that's toxic. We need that to get socialized, and then we need to let it go.
Yeah, I think also a very basic insight at this point is that the best thing one can do for themselves is to act altruistically. It's counterintuitive, and I mean it's a non sequitur of a sentence, but empirically, this is very much the case, which is beautiful and wonderful, and it's really my hope that the work that we're doing to try and to promote that new vision for reality, which as I say is an old vision as well, will also will find teeth in the dominant cultural narrative, which is the scientific, and my guess is that it will have to be done through slow baby steps, but maybe one day we'll be able to come back to and say we finally reached Gregg's garden through our slow work and we managed to integrate.
I think it's listen, we're little fleas on a Titanic that's got a lot of momentum and a lot of inertia, so it'll take a little while. I do think, though, if we thread ourselves together a particular way and are actually able to specify it and have a translatable communal knowledge, right? If we're actually able to do that, we'll have a chance. And then once if systems can get socialized so that a number of people speak the language and there's actually ways of doing it, that's what I see starting to happen as I had hoped. So that's why these conversations are absolutely key in relationship to it.
It's an exciting prospect. It's exciting to be a part of and to witness. And I think also it's exciting to participate in it with people that share so much generosity and of generosity of spirit and humility in conversation. And I know we didn't get to talk about this time, but I know that you went through a long journey of of working with your own shadow and getting over your own ego. And it's very, very evident, the humility to sit down and talk with a nothing and a no one, and share your thoughts and dialogue as a peer and as a fellow, and the same with John, has been absolutely humbling. So it's beautiful to see that the narrative which is emerging is also performative in the space that it's facilitating for these types of conversations. So that's really wonderful.
Well, it's feelings mutual, and I'll say, you said something about altruism. I would just say, actually, what I would just say is the key is being known and valued. Okay, so really, it's a healthy mutualism, and that's exactly what I feel in relationships with you. I look at you and say, oh, that warms my heart. That guy is doing good in the world, and if I connect with that and we go mutually connect together, we will mirror the goodness together in relation. You know, and that spreads relational value. Okay, at the core of being. If we spread relational value at the core of being, we're going to solve the mental health problem. I'm telling you. That's
a really beautiful formulation, and I really do hope to internalize these messages, and I think the cliches that are often true is that the change begins right here and within, and I hope that I can exemplify some of these principles and then exemplify them in a relationship and then begin to mirror those outwards, and it's very touching to hear that in response. So thank you.
I mean, I listened to you for about 5 minutes, like, I want to talk to that guy. So, whatever, radar I have, clinical psych radar or whatever, it took about, very limited frequency coming off of you being like, that's a good guy. Let's talk to that.
I very much appreciate that. I see my egoic side wants to hear more about what you thought about me, but instead, I'm going to put that aside. I'm going to do the altruistic.
We'll come to you talking with Gregg, and then we'll get your story. I really look forward to that.
Looking forward. Instead, what I'd like to ask as a final word to the audience is if you have a final message that you may feel that might encapsulate something from this conversation or lead to something new, some sort of a gesture towards wisdom, towards transcendence, as you've been saying it, what might that final word be?
Well, I'll share, as I started to sort of on this journey, and we can maybe get into that, but ultimately I was like, well, what is my compass, and I have lots of different angles on that compass now, but one that I landed on back in 2011, which still holds, is a compass that invites us to be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. And that's my signature line. And that, to me, that encapsulates a lot of kind of truth, goodness, and beauty orientation across the collective. So I'll offer that, and I'll share that with you as a thought.
To be that which
enhances dignity,
yes, and
well-being,
yes,
with integrity.
Beautiful. That's really beautiful, Gregg. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. I knew I wanted to be here as soon as I've been seeking unity for a long time, friend. And you built a YouTube channel that spoke to my heart, so it was really wonderful that I got a chance to connect.
I'm really glad. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gregg, and I hope to be in touch going forward as well.
Yeah, we'll get something on the thing for July.
Much love.
Okay, take care.